Arcus 10190. I was lured by a gleaming light in the distance that caught my attention in the otherwise perfect darkness. I went to investigate, and it wasn't until the mouth of the cave I had stepped into closed that I realized my mistake. I had entered a Balzagar, a giant worm of the void, which Bara often writes about in his earlier work for serial magazines. In his stories, the creature is often hunted by survivors, as its blood can be used as a type of fuel for makeshift vehicles and mechanisms. Lucky for me, I remembered one story where a survivor in a similar situation found a sword to hack his way out of the creature before suffering an agonizing death in a bubbling pit of acid. Remembering the story, I quickly scanned my surroundings and spotted an axe. With a great sense of urgency, I yanked it out of the skeleton's hands and hacked away as massive tendrils from its digestive tract tried without success to pull me into its stomach. I undoubtedly survived the ordeal and collected a sample of its blood to analyze its curious properties. The truth be told, it's hard to believe I'm still alive. My research has clearly paid off in countless ways. How many times have I been inspired by the events of a seemingly random story I cannot say. More than I can remember, to be sure. "12 past midnight. Surin woke up in the near dark with a vague recollection of being pulled through a wall of dense fog. He remembered the theater in Greenville, the winding staircase below, and a familiar voice calling out to him. He had been investigating the strange disappearance of a podcaster and a troop of parents from all over the world searching for their missing loved ones. That investigation had led him to a theater in Greenville, and now to this strange world he couldn't make heads or tails of. Rising on shaky legs, Surin looked at a murder of crows hovering above him. He swiveled left and right and fixed his gaze on a thick meat hook dangling from a gnarled tree. As Surin stared at the gleaming hook, he heard a twig snap behind him and ducked just as a razor-sharp claw whirred past his head. He scrambled backward as he took in a creature like a massive gargoyle approaching him. But as the creature raised its claws to deliver the death blow, the sound of a horn blared through the darkness. It hissed and turned, a moment too late. A minibus with spikes and blades attached to the grill smashed and dashed the creature to pieces. Surin looked up at the blood-covered windshield. The wipers suddenly cleared blood and gore to reveal Grace and Haley, only younger than he remembered. And beside her was her missing stepbrother Jaden and others he recognized from her videos and podcasts. They had somehow succeeded. They had found their loved ones. But where? Where had they found them? Where had they been taken to? Where had he been taken to? Surin had more questions than answers, and he wasn't even sure he wanted to know more about this cosmic hell he had been pulled into. He felt like his mind might implode at any moment. The doors of the bus opened with a squelching noise, and Olivia and Sean called out to Surin to get on the bus as a terrible shriek resounded through the realm. The Magnificent Maurice 3. And that apparently wasn't that. The pups ignored my every attempt to scare them away and followed me through the woods, across a meadow, and all the way to the edge of a small town. I stood in the darkness staring at the glowing orange lights in the distance like fireflies. Tired, I laid down, closed my eyes, and tried to forget everything at the farm. Then I started when I felt something small push against my side. I turned with eyes wide open to see the pups curling up beside me to keep warm. "Didn't I tell you to stay away?" "Yep," they each replied in turn. I sighed and closed my eyes again. I was too tired to protest, and so I just wished them a good night. I dreamed of my mother and didn't want to wake up. I wanted to live in that dream. When I finally drifted back to reality, it was morning, and the pups were already gnawing on bones and slurping spaghetti and all kinds of other waste they had pulled out of someone's trash. I helped myself to a few rotten apples. When I was done, I stood and told them quite frankly that I didn't know anything about dogs and that I didn't know what to do with them. And they answered it was okay because they didn't know anything about horses and it probably didn't matter any which way. I released a deep breath and wondered what to do next when one of the pups suggested we go to the mountains. He figured we should get away from the town as we probably wouldn't be welcome. I figured he was probably right, and that heading to the mountains wasn't such a bad idea. And so the pups charged for the mountains, but stopped suddenly when they realized I was hesitating. "What's the matter, Boz?" one of them asked. Then they all pleaded with me to follow them, each one calling me Boz, on account they had mistaken me for another horse at the farm who quite frankly didn't even look like me. The whole way to the mountains I tried correcting them with regard to my real name, but it was pointless, and I figured, what the hey? If they wanted to call me Boz, they could call me Boz. There were worse things in life than being called the wrong name. Don't I know that now? Anyway, back to the story. It wasn't long before we were pushing up a mountain when the pups began to talk about their mum, and all at once began to slow down as though they were walking through thick molasses. I didn't say anything, because there is nothing to say when you lose a parent. I just mentioned that their mum and my mum were together now, looking out for us, and that they would want us safe. One by one, they agreed, and as we started up again, they told me they hadn't been named, and that their mum was waiting for inspiration. And so, I promised I'd name them all when I felt inspired, just like their mum would have wanted. They seemed satisfied with that answer as we climbed up the mountain and approached a cave which seemed to be the perfect place to rest. But just as soon as we neared the entrance, one pup froze suddenly, warning us not to go in, and swore that there was a great darkness inside. His brothers and sisters laughed and said that of course there was a darkness inside, it was a cave. But he shook his head and said he meant something else. Something evil. Something evil like the old farmer. He then told us a story of men shooting each other up for money and moonshine. Well, despite his warning, I entered the cave, telling the pups to wait for me by the entrance. And just as soon as I stepped into the darkness, there it was. The smell. No, not a smell. A stench. A stench that hit me like a bag full of bricks and turned my guts inside out. It took me a moment before I continued again. With careful steps, I moved through shadows and dappled light coming from cracks above. The stench, if you can believe it, got even worse as I entered a small cavern with shiny equipment that dripped moonshine from bullet holes. And that's when I saw it. A heap of rotting bodies and blood-stained paper money scattered all over the ground, just as the little one had described. I backed out slowly, retracing my steps, trying to figure out how he had known. I never did figure that one out, but I did figure out his name. I called him Trouble, not because he was trouble, but because he always knew if we were heading into trouble with his creepy premonitions. Saga of the Redcrane, the Lost Realm of the Nine. Saku stood before a mountain of solid black rock. She stepped over the charred remains of hundreds of unlucky seekers who had found an untimely and gruesome end trying to enter the Lost Realm. She stared down at her map and the symbols she had discovered throughout her seemingly endless journey to find a way out of this living prison. She stared at the symbols and sighed sadly, and wasn't sure what to do. She wished her friend was still with her. He would have ideas. He would know what to do. He had a much better understanding of this dark world than she ever did. He would know if she had chosen the right symbols and ordered the correct sequence. They had talked often about the past, and they had discussed the stories and the notes they had gathered, and he seemed to know what parts were relevant and what parts weren't. But he wasn't with her anymore, and there was nothing she could do about that now. With a sigh, she collected a stone from the grasp of a skeleton, and she began to etch a sequence of 9 symbols in the wall before her. She carved the sequence 9 times, and soon found herself staring at the arcane patterns, waiting for something to happen. But nothing happened. At least, she thought, she was still alive. That meant she had etched the correct sequence. And then, remembering a moment in a story she had discarded as irrelevant, she heaved a deep breath and held it as she visualized a doorway that would lead her back home. Then she released her breath over the wall. As Saku breathed life over the patterns, the symbols illuminated, and white smoky mist suddenly rose from the ground to engulf her. Moments later, the symbols faded and the mist dissipated to reveal a doorway into the heart of the mountain. She stared at the doorway with disbelieving eyes. She had been waiting for this moment for what felt like an eternity. With cautious steps, she inched forward and gazed into the cavern beyond the doorway where a narrow bridge disappeared into an ocean of white mist. Slowly, Saku entered the mountain and began to walk across the wooden bridge as tendrils of white mist seemed to attack her from both sides. Suddenly, sounds from her past emerged and seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Horrible sounds, terrible sounds, cries, screams, shrieks. She could even hear her mother's voice warning her to turn back while she still had a chance. At once, Saku froze and closed her eyes to compose herself. She breathed in deeply, and she slowly released her fears and doubts. As the hellish cacophony faded, she opened her eyes and continued forward in the almost perfect silence, despite the tendrils that continued to lash out at her with every step. She walked for hours and perhaps even days before she finally realized she would die before she reached the end. Perhaps there wasn't even an end to reach. Perhaps the bridge went on forever. Saku scrunched her fist and let out a moan of despair when she realized this was just another trial, another way for this living prison to feed off her fears and anguish. She was trapped without hope. For several minutes, she stood there as if she had been glued to the bridge, every muscle in her body tensed. The loud sound of some sort of energy vibrating at a very high rate tormented her as the mist continued to lash out. The experience was unlike any she had ever undergone before. She could not think of a single move by which to continue her journey. But then, a great calmness came over her as she saw something in the mist. Something that she hadn't noticed before. Something that had been there all along. The mist. It wasn't attacking her. It was testing her. Beckoning her. Saku laughed out loud with the realization. The tendrils weren't a warning to stay out, but an invitation to come in. She could see it clearly now, and she could see how they were trying to prevent her from continuing forward because she was going the wrong way. And so, she closed her eyes, cleared her mind, and with a fearless heart, she unsheathed her katana with a resounding ring and raised it high above her head. Then she sliced straight through the bridge and felt the world collapse beneath her feet.